Brianna with Citizen, and we're talking today about the barriers to research and being able to empower patient-centric research. To get a little bit started, I am an Invitae employee. No other disclosures to make. Invitae actually acquired Citizen about 2 years ago, and we'll get into how the Citizen platform works. But want to give everyone a little bit of an orientation first. We're going to talk a little bit about just bare bone basics, going back to the beginning, about what is real world data, how does it fit in when we talk about data in research, and then where does Citizen fit into these models, and what has Citizen done to date, and how does this potentially help you, your families, your clinics move more information forward so that we can better outcomes for patients with epilepsy. So getting started at the very beginning, we start talking about research and everyone says, I need the data. What do they mean when they say data, and what kind of data are they talking about? So a little bit of definitions, taking a step way back. When we start talking about doing research, we all start with let's start at the very beginning. We're going to be Maria von Trapp and talk about this Sound of Music style. So when we start talking about research and where things fit together, we have to start at an idea. So this is the step one discovery concept. So what is the question? What is the problem? What is the idea on a way that we could potentially fix this? Does that idea already exist or not? Most of the time the answer is not really or not at all, and so we start moving into what do we need to have in place in order to make this something that we could do in humans. So we start with the very beginnings of preclinical research, where we look for information on what is known, what is unknown. What do we know if we stick it in a test tube? What do we know if we look at it under the microscope? And then we start moving into live models. So we start talking about mouse models and zebrafish models and what other things can we test it in real life that are not people. Once we've really validated that space, we move into how does this work in people, both healthy people and then people that are our population of interest. In this case, people, standard population, and then people that have seizures. Is it safe? And then does it work? That's really the area we're going to be focusing in on today. Once we get to the yes, it's safe and yes, it works, then we start working through the process of FDA reviews and approvals to make it a marketable drug that can be prescribed in your regular doctor's office. But starting at the very beginning, the goal of this really is to review the data and information, to look for potential problems that could come up and how is this available and how does it interact with existing therapies. And then what does it mean to the general public? What do we know about it? What still needs to be known? And how do we make sure that we get you the best quality drug available without it being risky to make it into a generic? How do we make sure that all of that quality is consistent across every market that gets access? So getting into data itself, we look at where do we get this information from. So starting with a natural history study is often where most of our pharmaceutical companies will begin. They start by asking, what do we know about this population? And we start with observing what is known. So the natural history study, according to the FDA, is a pre-planned observational study, meaning no interventions, no changes in medication, that's intended to track the course of disease. So essentially what happens in this condition if we just step back and watch. We don't do anything different. It doesn't mean we're pulling away drug. It means what if we do the standard, what is normally recommended, what are the outcomes that we can expect, and are those expectations consistent? It means we're identifying who are these patients, what do we see over time for them, what is measurable in their condition, what do we expect to be able to count or see as an expected outcome. Are these things that we want to see? Are these things that we can then treat or would want to treat? Often in epileptic conditions, we talk about seizures being the outcome, but what if there are other outcomes to measure as well? Are seizures the primary thing we want to control, or are there other outcomes like decreased hospitalizations, better milestone observations, if it's better feeding opportunities? And then how do we treat them traditionally today, and how do they respond to that treatment? A response is typically better than nothing, but what if that response comes with side effects? Are those side effects outweighing the benefits of treatment? And does that treatment, with all of its side effects, outweigh potential detriments of doing nothing at all? We then start to move into the different ways that you can get that natural history information. So real-world data is literally taking the data that exists in the patient's typical day-to-day healthcare journey, all of the treatment that goes in on their standard of care. So it's not in a controlled environment. This doesn't mean that we've gone to a clinical trial set up and said, we are going to take this group of 20 patients and we are going to have them come to the same doctor at the same time every month for the next 5 years, and we're going to count the same things for every one of them. We're saying we want to see what happens to people in their typical environment when they're seeing their regular doctors, they're going to school, they're getting sick, they're coming to Disneyland, and how are they responding in their typical environment. Based on the information we can get from that real world setting, we then can start making some conclusions and start drawing up some additional questions. And this is what we would define as real world evidence. So it's taking all of that real world data information and starting to draw correlations or conclusions about what are the potential benefits and risks that we see in this patient population. So asking those questions, again, outside of a standard study setup of, is there efficacy? Are there benefits to this treatment? Is it safe? What are the side effects? And how does it compare to what the other options are? To give an example of using these two ideas or concepts, we ask the question, how many people with syndrome X develop symptom B? So of everyone that we know that has this same diagnosis, how many of them are going to have this specific outcome? If we use a traditional natural history study, it means that we collect that group of patients, we bring them all to the same trial site, we give all of them the same drug, and then we evaluate to see what happens. Using real-world data, it means that we're doing more of a look back and or look forward in their typical trajectory. So finding a data source that will collect that information already in a standard environment and includes the symptoms that we're trying to track. We then go through and measure what that looks like over time and then do that look back to compare the typical patient population or our control patient population with all of the patients that we now know have this condition. Where are they the same? Where are they different? Often when we look for real-world data sources, we look at 3 primary sources that can either be standalone or combined with each other. Most of us have heard of patient registries where patients can join. This is often self-reported information to say, how old was I when I was diagnosed? How many medications have I taken? What have my experiences over the last week, month, year looked like? Claims data is using all of the insurance codes to be able to pull information. So how many patients have a diagnosis that was the reason that led to a change in medication? How many patients were written a prescription for this specific medication? How many patients had an EEG in the last year? All of this is based off of the insurance coding to be able to bill and get reimbursed both by the insurance companies, the hospitals, and the patients. So it's not always the most accurate, and you may actually find that more often than not, providers are busy. They'll type in the first code that fits or will get them reimbursed for the services that they provide. They may put in codes that they know will get reimbursed even if they're not 100% accurate for the patient's situation in order to benefit that patient and get them the care that the physician recommends. We may be missing codes as well, where there's kind of additional codes connected to the main code, where we have a code for epilepsy. We have a separate code for tonic-clonic seizures. We have a separate code for Keppra. But if they just put in epilepsy, we may be missing the rest of the picture in the claims data. And then finally, we have medical records, and these can be as specific or as generalized as the sources where we can get the information. If you go into your MyChart or patient portal, you may see the summaries of these were all of the dates of the visit. And they're typically accurate, but they only have to be accurate within 72 hours of the visit. So the date that the report was written may not be the same date as the date of service. You may be able to do an EMR crawl where someone's research study is able to connect directly to AthenaCare or to Epic or to another EMR and pull out all of the structured data where someone filled out a form and we can pull all of those form responses. Or you can get the raw records themselves that include the complete physician history. It includes all of the documentation, but it's unstructured and it's unwieldy. It's typically thousands of pages of information that we don't have an easy way to sort through. So it's a lot of time and resources to then go through and pull out the information we're looking for. Each of these sources has significant benefits to the information that they can glean, but each of them also has a lot of drawbacks in the limitations that exist. So Citizen stepped in to try to find a way to start to combine those resources, as well as take a lot of the legwork off of the researchers and the patients themselves. So Citizen's approach to data collection is to put the patient at the center of everything that happens. We come from the premise of patient information is theirs, it's yours to do with as you see fit, and you have the right to own it and use it. And so we ask patients to consent to data sharing, to consent to record collection, rather than going to their providers or trying to get de-identified sources or going to claims aggregators that don't consent patients at all. And so we ask for the complete medical record, being able to pull out all of the information, but also being able to provide that contact with the patient to maintain relationships. So we can go back and get patient-reported information. We can connect the patient to a claims aggregator. We can get the medical records. And then let the patient make the decisions about what should be done with this information. Is it going to be used for myself to be able to get a second opinion with a new provider because I have all of my records in one place and I don't need to wait months for a new appointment? Is it to connect with patient support groups that have built out a registry and are trying to say, how many patients do we have with this condition? How many patients in the United States? How many patients in California, so that we could start talking to a biopharma about a clinical trial? Is it going to be beneficial for the pharmaceutical companies and the academic researchers who say, I'm really interested in this rare type of seizure, but I don't know anything about it. Where do I start? The literature reviews are all 10 years old. Is there anything new to be known? And really bringing all of those key stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem back together. We're able to collect the genetic and genomic information. We're able to collect the clinician ordering behaviors. So when a patient presents with seizures, how often are they getting genetic testing? How often are they getting referred for an MRI? How often are they starting on an anti-seizure medication? We're able to connect them to the claims data, so to ask how many of these patients do go on to have hospitalizations? How many of them are stable on the first prescribed drug that they receive? We're able to connect to the imaging to say, what do the EEGs look like? What does brain imaging look like for this patient? And then again, the ability to go back to the patients themselves and ask, what has your experience been? This is what the medical records say. Is it consistent with what you're experiencing at home or on vacation? When we consent patients to the platform, we give them the option to choose how involved and how much they want their information to be used for themselves and for other purposes. So every patient that comes to the Citizen platform has access to their own records. We also ask if they want to connect with patient advocacy groups to be able to share their information and get involved in the community. We ask if they want to be involved in research. If they say yes, we're able to take those next steps and use that data to further information about epilepsy and care of patients. Once patients sign up through that process, we leverage the HIPAA right of access, where every patient under US law has the right to own and access their own healthcare information. But we then do the legwork of following up with those providers and institutions, filling out the forms, going back and getting reminders, asking them, letting them know that we're missing segments of healthcare records. We then upload all of that information to your Citizen account and hand it back to you. It's yours to own and manage. If you've consented to participating in research, it means that our expert team of clinicians, along with some of our AI machine learning, is able to go through and curate that record set to start to structure all of the unstructured medical records, where we can annotate every data point that exists from the very beginning of your healthcare journey. As we've gone back through and looked at the way that healthcare records exist today, many of you are familiar with the patient binder or binders or filing cabinet, where you try to print out every summary and every visit that the provider had. You try to remember everything and then be able to recall it the next time that someone says, tell me why you're here today. We try to take that workload off of you, where we provide that annotation in the records as well as provenance in the records themselves, where we can say, yes, we reported that John Doe's seizure started on April 1st, 2010, and this is exactly where in the medical records we saw it. This is the neurologist or the epileptologist that confirmed that information. We're not just saying it because that's what we expect to see for this patient. We then have that data QC'd or go through quality control by additional expert human clinicians. This isn't us saying the first time we see it, we expect everyone to be perfect at pulling data points out. And we typically have somewhere from 2 to up to 5 rounds of human clinician review done by neurologists, epileptologists, genetic counselors, physician assistants, nurses, to make sure that we are pulling accurate information and that we're consistently calling it the same thing. And then we structure that data so that no longer is it thousands and thousands of pages of letters and information back and forth, but it's now a CSV or an Excel file that can be handed off to researchers to be able to learn more about these conditions, to be able to point out what are the critical pieces in this condition that we need to focus on first. What are the patient needs? What is the community's need? This is an example of what that patient portal looks like from the patient perspective, where once you come into the portal, you have the ability to control everything that happens with your information. We have a share option built in where you can use this to link out to anyone that needs the information that exists in your healthcare records. If this is grandma who is watching your son for the weekend and needs to know what the medication dosages are. If this is a new neurologist because we're looking at a clinical trial and they need the background information. If this is an emergency care visit because we had a seizure while we were at Disneyland, it means that we are able to pull that information instantly and provide it via that secure link back to whomever needs information to better care for the patient. Within the records as well, you can see the images here, and there's actually the MRI images hiding behind our Share Your Data link, where you can get the actual images themselves from the PACS server. You can get every document from the physicians, and it all then gets uploaded into your account. You're able to see all of the information sorted by institution, by upload, or chronologically to be able to learn more about your own journey as well, where it's not at all unreasonable that in those first visits, as well as throughout the journey, there are times that it's overwhelming to sit in a doctor's office, that there's so much going on, there are so many questions. The physician may be unloading information back at you as well. Often records have said that when we go through and review patient recall, typically about 5 to 10% of the visit is actually remembered accurately. There's just so much going on. Now you have access to that documentation to be able to say, what were the pieces I missed? Can I go back and review? Let me think this through. Let me go look this up. Now I have more questions. I'm going to write them down so I can be specific at my next visit. A lot of the questions we get as we talk through this portal is often, what about the security piece? How do you make sure that you get my records? How do you make sure that someone else doesn't get my records? How do you make sure that the information you're sharing for research purposes is maintained in a private, confidential, safe way? So all of the information sharing that we do, starting with just collecting your information, is regulated through the institutional review boards, which is an ethics process to make sure that there is a research protocol that has been vetted for the ethical strength of the question that supports that process or that research study. We then go through levels of consent as well, where we ask every patient to consent to the privacy terms of the platform itself, and then we ask about your interest in collecting medical records, in connecting with patient support groups, and in connecting with research opportunities. Beyond the terms and services of the platform, there is no requirement that you must say yes to any of the additional consents, and we take that into account as we collect records on your behalf as well. Within the privacy piece as well, we do confirm identity of every person that joins the platform. That's not just those that own their account either, but also those that you may be sharing with, that we make sure that we verify that the email address is associated with a real person. We ask them to set up an account that is then linked to yours. And you can see and be able to go look back at who you've shared information with, what you shared, when you shared it, and be able to apply that consent in that data sharing process as well. You create your own unique login at the time of account creation, and you can manage that password as well. We provide frequent communication options as well through email and text and phone calls if you opt into all or none of the above, where we make sure that you're updated on any changes in our platform, any changes in our policies, as well as any major good or bad things that may come out of it as well, that you're one of the first to be aware. We do go through standard data encryption policies as well to make sure that everything is encrypted, both going in and going out of the platform, so that it doesn't get caught in between by hackers or by somebody else. And then we do have jurisdiction-specific privacy provisions as well, where privacy requirements may be different in the state of New York versus the state of California. And we make sure that we abide by all of them for all patients, because we recognize that healthcare often is not limited to one provider or even one state. When your data has the opportunity to be shared, if you consent, we do go through and de-identify all of the information before it ever leaves the platform. We remove all of your identifying information, your name, your date of birth, your address, your contact information, and assign a unique codified identifier, so a string of numbers and letters that attaches your information together, but not necessarily to you uniquely. We base it off of your consents as well, and you have the ability to withdraw consent at any time. So if you say today, yes, I want to do research, and tomorrow I don't, I can go back in and withdraw that consent, and moving forward, none of that information is shared anymore. As with the collection process on our end, every time we share information, we require having that ethical provision under a regulatory board for research approval. And this occurs both on the provider or the researcher's end, as well as review of it on our own internal end, where we have a data use and a medical affairs committee that go through and review every request for data to make sure that this is ethical, safe, private practices. And then finally, we ask that everyone that accesses the data, both internally and externally, commits to a secure storage of the data, both requiring that they do not attempt to ever re-identify patients, as well as making sure that they are storing the information in a safe way that can't be picked up by someone else. Some of the examples, so pivoting over at this point, we've talked about what is real-world data, how can it be used. We've talked about the platform and the way that our approach works, but what does that mean? What good is it doing today? A lot of the information that we have available through Citizen has probably already percolated some new questions in your own mind about your own care or about the population that you're affiliated with. We're tending to use the research currently both for validation of the platform, so making sure that we can prove that our processes are accurate and comprehensive. We've done a number of studies comparing traditional medical records review by an expert in the clinic to our team at Ciitizen and saying, is there concordance? Is this the same process? Can we get the same results? We've been able to do individual patient mapping to be able to say, I can track this patient from date of birth to today and even moving forward and be able to see what their outcomes are. And then compare them back to the population. Where does this patient fit in with every other patient with Dravet? Or where does this patient fit in with every other patient that had seizures in adolescence? We're able to talk about medication usage. So where are we tracking our patients that have multiple anti-seizure medications? And is that consistent with best practices? What are some of the outcomes and the way that they're related to things like neurodevelopment if you're on multiple medications at a time? One of the biggest, from a news perspective, pieces that we've been able to do was a study that we did with Praxis Precision Medicines, where we are currently working with them on their new ASO gene therapy program for a specific SCN2A related seizure disorder. For this story started back in 2020, where our platform started in about 2017. We started adding in epilepsy and rare disease in 2020. The fall of that year, we started conversations with Praxis Precision Medicines about potentially using our data as their natural history as they were starting towards learning more about this condition and wanting to develop new therapies and treatments. We signed a contract with them at the end of 2020, and we started recruitment for this patient population in February of 2021. We met our population requirement goal by May, and we were able to deliver data for that population by the end of the summer of that same year. By January of 2022, they were able to use that data exclusively in an IND filing with the FDA to say, this is our natural history study, this is what's known about this patient population. And that IND was accepted in August of 2022. Praxis Precision Medicines then went on to start their clinical trial and started recruitment, starting with this patient population that they already had known background information on, that we had contact information to say this population is consented to learning more about research opportunities. And we were able to reach out to those same patients and let them know about an upcoming clinical trial. They were able to start that enrollment. They were able to close their phase 1 at the beginning of 2023, and 75% of the patients that enrolled in their trial came through the Citizen platform. They've now dosed that entire phase 1 of their trial and are seeing positive outcomes, and their first outreads came out this year. So if you start at the beginning of their journey, the first conversations in fall of 2020, to now the end of their phase 1 of their clinical trial, it took us 3 years. In standard practice, these processes typically take years to decades to get through.
And so our goal is really being realized through groups like Praxis and other companies that we've been working with to be able to warp speed treatment for epilepsy. Going into some of those details, so it's, okay, great, they used our data. What was useful? What did we find from it? Praxis was able to look at things like the clinical phenotype. So what do we know about this patient population? What does the literature have to say about it? And is it still consistent with what we see in patients today? What do we know about the biophysics? Are we able to rely on that clinical phenotype, or are there other values that we need to pay attention to? Is the phenotype actually associated with outcomes, or is there something in between that we need to be measuring instead? What should we be looking at for this patient population? Is it seizures? Is it something else? How can we move from the information that we know about this population to reaching out to the population to get them involved in research and in our clinical trial? What can we do? What can we learn about this population and the medications they're on to be able to go back to those animal models and those test tubes and plug things in ahead of time as we're structuring our new treatment? What can we expect to see? What do we want to see? Can we model what we know about this patient population into the earlier stages so that we can get to clinical trial? Can we look for specifics that are better able to target knowing this diagnosis? So looking at markers in the EEG, looking at the type of mutations in the genetic report to know exactly who this medication will be best for, to get to that precision medicine of this is the treatment for you, but it may not be the best treatment for the person next to you. And then finally being able to confidently report back to the FDA that all of the information that they have is accurate, is comprehensive, it meets all of the requirements that they need to be able to move into clinical trials and treatments. Digging into some of the specifics there, we were able to show things like the number of data points that we had across the population, across all of the different areas that we're able to collect entities or data points in the different types of things you can learn about a patient. Noting that most of these patients, and you can even make that assumption looking at this chart, have a lot of healthcare incidences and interactions in that first year of life. And then it tends to taper off over time, but it never goes away. These aren't patients that resolve, get better, and go on to lead typical, neurotypical lives. It means that we were able to look at what is the severity of the experience for these patients. How often are they getting hospitalized in that first year of life, and how long are those hospitalizations lasting? Is this something where we can say the cost of a gene therapy is ultimately potentially a cost-saving benefit compared to multiple hospitalizations over the decades of life that these patients have? We can talk about the seizure severity, where we were able to create our own comparison score based off of the frequency, the prolonged seizures that these patients were having. So what type of seizures they had, what medications they were on, what their hospitalizations looked like, to say how much of a burden is this on healthcare? Because whenever we start talking about new drugs, it always comes back to insurance coverage and cost. Is the cost saving of this new expensive drug better than standard treatment today and the hospitalizations involved? Those that have the bullet points further up the score, so as you approach 4, are the more severe patients. And you can see that the majority of these patients are not mild, low incidence healthcare utilization. The majority of these patients are significant burden on healthcare from a cost perspective, which is just the beginning of being able to argue the point that we do need a better option. And then being able to reconnect with all of these patients. Everyone that we have on the platform has at least an email address. We often have a phone number. We often have location on where these patients are. And so researchers are able to say, do I want to have a standard clinical trial? Where do I want those sites to be? Where are these patients being seen regularly? Is this something where I can say I'm going to have 4 sites across the country? Or do I need to decentralize and come to the patients because they can't travel? Is this a group that I can look for a definitive way to reach out via one source? Or is this a group that we're going to have to get creative in the ways that we make this a trial that is worth participating in? It also means that we can add additional information as well. So we were able to go back to this same group of patients and get additional information as Praxis Precision Medicine started wanting to learn more about these patients. They had new questions come up around The frequency of seizures. Is the frequency of seizures reported by the neurologist the same as the frequency that's actually being seen at home? When the neurologist says they've had more than 5 seizures a week, is that 5? Is that 6? Is that 20? Is that 500? What does more than 5 mean? And so we were able to go back to the patients and ask for those specifics. We could get a seizure diary where we could say consistently over the same 30 days for every patient in the population, this is what we saw. We were able to get their own feedback as well on what they saw as the most important needs that were being unmet currently in their population. Was it seizures? Was it sleep? Was it quality of life? Another example, so this is coming from a different population, but getting back to this idea of being able to track the individual patient journey. We were able to plug this particular patient in compared to everyone else and say, where do they line up? Often when you see a physician, they're able to plot you on a growth curve. This is how tall you are compared to the general population. This is where your milestones are compared to the general population. But when we start talking about chronic healthcare conditions and when we start talking about rare diseases, there is no general population. There's a limited population that has these experiences, and of course you're not going to look like the general population. But how do we know if you're meeting the expectations for your specific instance? And so we're able to start taking these patients and say, this is what we see for your patient, this is what we see for you, this is what we see for your population. These are the medications that seem to be working best. These are the places where people have the hardest time getting insurance coverage. These are the individual doctors that seem to have a better grasp or see more of these patients and could be considered experts in the field. These are the potential next steps that you could take. Going through this idea, at the end of the day, it's great to have information. It's great to be able to have your information. It's even better to have your information available to make it available to everyone else to learn more, because the more we can learn together, the faster we can go together. Currently, and I can't even say currently anymore, this was done at the beginning of the month when we put slides together, but we've got over 50 patient advocacy groups that we actively work with to build their communities and provide information back to them. We have patients in all 50 states as well as a number of countries across the world. We've had 15 and growing partnerships with biopharmaceutical companies that are actively working on epilepsy patient organizations and conditions where they want to develop new therapies. We've had, just in 2023, and again, already outdated this month, but we're at 6 academic collaborations where we've been able to share with academic researchers, with clinicians, to be able to get their thoughts on these patient populations as well. We've had 5 publications this year coming from our rare disease cohorts, and 2 outreaches back to these patient populations for new clinical trials. This means that we have over 11,000 hospitals and clinics across the United States that we've collected information from, and thousands of families, and still growing. But it also means we're not done. It also means we need each of us and each of you to be able to build the community together so that we can get to better outcomes. And that's it. Are there any, and thankfully I've got team members here too, but any questions today or anything we can help with? Yeah. It's really just how many patients. So a lot of these, the red dots just mean there's more patients. I couldn't zoom in close enough to get each individual state because then we lost Hawaii and Alaska. So it's really just how densely populated. So you can see, there's 325 patients in the southwest area of the U.S. I promise it's not just California, compared to we have 1 in Alaska. Yes?
You use 2 words, a burden on the healthcare system and disseminating everyone's information. 2 things that I, as a patient, mother of a patient, I would be very protective of. 1, she's not a burden on the healthcare system.
Absolutely.
So I would take that out of her information. That was very offending and it got me very mad. We are dealing with situations where a drop in the ocean for those rare patients, they're nothing on the general population when it comes to the cost. So it's really important that control that something like Cittizen would have with the FDA brought us OxyContin. I mean, we have to be careful about how much power we're feeding the FDA and who's involved and all these thousands of people and the money. Because that burden word means money.
Absolutely. I appreciate the feedback. Yeah, I appreciate the feedback, and we have had results that aren't just about the healthcare systems themselves as well. We've had feedback directly from families on how this benefits day-to-day life. You're right. Unfortunately, we're in a place today where the conversations often start around the money, and that's where we hope to change this. That it's not about the money; it's about the quality of life.
Who would have access to this system of the data?
Yeah. So broadly, anyone that has an approved research protocol. So we go through the institutions in internal regulatory review boards. So anyone with an IRB or equivalent in international cases, approved research protocol. So this can be academic researchers, this can be clinicians, this can be biopharma. But we do ask that they have this approved ethically for you so that it's not getting into what is my data being used for? Is it being used against me? Is it being used for something completely unrelated to me and my experience? We want to make sure that it's being used for the best purposes. So we do ask for that ethics review. And then we go through our own internal processes as well, where we have an internal medical affairs team of experts that reviews the research question, the way that the data will be used, the plans to disseminate the outcomes from it. Because there's no point to doing the research if the outcomes aren't shared back out, even if it's not the outcomes we're looking for. And then we also have our data use committee, where we have a number of regulatory and ethics experts, including those that have worked through the Department of Health and Human Services. We have individuals that helped write the laws for HIPAA that review these research proposals as well. What was that?
Consent.
For
The data is only ever shared with the express consent of the participant.
Right.
So when you onboard, and at any time throughout, you can decide whether or not the data you're comfortable with it being shared or not. And if the answer is no, that's fine. You can use the platform however you want, but the data will never be shared until that consent piece is in place as well.
And you limit the sharing.
One thing that you can do is you can just say no to everything, and then that way we can reach out on a study-by-study basis, and you can evaluate who's running the study, how do I feel about the safety or the research question. It may or may not be of interest to you, and then you can kind of consent on a study-by-study basis.
You also have the ability to withdraw that consent at any point as well. So if you say yes today and later change your mind, you can withdraw consent and we no longer share ever again.
Do the third parties have direct access to search that, or do they send it to you and you broker that search, like you provide the search and provide them, or do they directly access it?
At this time, it's the latter. So we ask them for their population of interest. We give them the count of how many patients we have that have consented to sharing information. And then we provide them with a secure data delivery, and we require that they tell us how they are securely storing that information on their end as well.
Okay, but they're not just poking around, they don't have access.
They don't have access, no.
And we're sharing de-identified data, so we're not sharing the raw medical records either. Just want to make sure that's clear.
Yes.
But aren't you asking for having diagnosis that you're submitting to the healthcare agencies or the insurance companies, and you're requesting patients that have that diagnosis?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
When you're looking for data,
Mm-hmm.
and you're going to get it from a patient that's got the problem, so you have to supply the companies with the diagnosis that you're looking for patients.
So we go the opposite direction because it is the patients that come in and want the information first. So we have the patients come to the platform. Everything is patient initiated. If a company comes to us and said they have to have their question in mind as well, we don't say, hey, you should come, you should come to our platform because we have data on. We have them come to us and say, I'm really interested in this population. How many patients do you have? If we have a number that is able to support their study, we can move forward. If not, we stay in touch and say, we're going to continue to work with all of the populations that we support. You can continue your work independently or in conjunction with us as well. But we don't give them free rein to say, this is what we have, what do you like?
How is the patient identified on your computer program what information is in the system.
Yeah, so we have separate places that information is stored to be sure that there is a minimal, if not no risk of being re-identified. So in your account, you see your raw record, you see your name, it's your account. When we share data externally, all of that identifying information is removed. And we've gone through certification processes to confirm that people can't re-identify the data. So you get replaced essentially with a string of numbers and letters. Rather than it being patient John Doe, it's this code or unique identifier. And that unique identifier follows the data points rather than you. Okay, thank you so much.